Snow pressed small and hard against the porch light, each flake a white question mark on the dark. A child's footprints cut a narrow trail through the drifts, tiny hollows like punctuation. Then a knock, one, two, frantic, followed by a voice, very small and flat, plainly alarmed. "My mom didn't wake up." Daniel Ross stood with his hand still on the door handle. For a moment, the world rearranged into two shapes, the voice and the dark behind it. He had been on his way to the car, briefcase tugging at his arm, the city already thinking about meetings and margins. The sentence landed like a stone, and the rest of the morning folded inward around it. He opened the door. A little girl blinked up at him, cheeks flushed pink from the cold, breath puffing in a series of small clouds. Her hair stuck out at odd angles beneath a knitted hat, and she clutched a worn stuffed rabbit by one arm. Snow clung to her boots. "Show me," Daniel said, because he needed something to do with his shock. His voice was steady, calm in a way that belonged to someone used to controlling rooms, but it didn't have time to be cold. The child hesitated, then turned and went, footprints leading back down the walk toward a building that looked like it had been there longer than anyone walking past it. Inside the stairwell, the air smelled like old laundry and heating oil. The apartment door was unlocked. Lily, he would learn her name in pieces, almost as if it were a spare thing she set down, moved as if she belonged in the dark, but the apartment did not answer her belonging. A couch, a small table, a television showing faint static. On the bed, a woman lay half-turned, a shawl puddled around her shoulders, pale in the winter light of the window. Mia. She wasn't breathing like she should. Her skin was cool where it showed. Her sleep was deeper than sleep. Daniel moved by habit at first, kneel, shoulder back, check for responsiveness. Then deliberately, because panic clutters hands. A pulse at the wrist, present but weak. Her lips were dry. Lily stood close by the bed, resolute and very small, looking at him as if she expected him to tell her the right story. "Call 911, Daniel told her. "Tell them where you are. Say you have an adult who won't wake up." Lily's voice trembled. She had already tried on the words before. "I did." She stopped, unable to finish the part about waiting. Daniel picked up his phone and dialed, but he did not stop with the call. He wrapped a thick blanket, one of two on the couch, around Mia, tucking it under her chin. He stripped off his own scarf and put it gently under the woman's head, propping her to one side to keep her airway clear. He took off his gloves and rubbed his hands against his own palms until he could feel his fingers again, then placed them lightly on Mia's cheek, feeling a paper-thin heat, the stubborn warmth that clung to the center of a person when everything else had cooled. "What's your name?" he asked Lily. "Lily," she said, as if confirming an account. "Lily, with a Y." He crouched on the floor and took a quick inventory. Shallow breathing, slow pulse, the color returning a little when warmed. There were no obvious injuries, no blood, hypothermia and exhaustion. He knew enough to be careful. Don't force liquids if breathing is shallow. Don't overheat suddenly. Keep them warm but not too warm. He could do pulse and breathing. He could talk calm. He could keep a child steady while professionals came. A moment later, a neighbor appeared in the doorway, rubbing his knuckles raw on his jacket. He'd called while Lily had stood on Daniel's porch, waiting for someone. The neighbor's presence felt like a small, honest human thing, someone else to explain to. It confirmed that this wasn't a fantasy. Daniel handed the phone to the neighbor with directions already forming. The ambulance was slow, the city's winter slow and slow in a way that made urgency taste metallic. Daniel stayed with Mia. He made tea with what little was in the cabinet, tea bags, one sugar packet, and held the mug beneath her nose so she could smell warmth. He whispered, "Breathe for me," more to anchor himself than to teach her anything. Lily sat on the edge of the couch, knees to chin, watching the steam rise. When the private physician arrived, Dr. Alvarez, a compact woman with a calm face and a medical bag that smelled of antiseptic. Daniel briefed her in 2 sentences. He had checked pulse and breath. He had warmed. He had called for help. Dr. Alvarez took over with a steady efficiency that settled the room into business. Oxygen, warming blankets, a quick blood pressure check, the polite but firm instruction that Mia needed to go to the clinic for observation and fluids. Mia opened her eyes once, blinking at the bright light over the bed. Small sounds escaped her. A cough, the fragile sound of someone arriving into daylight after a long swim. She gripped Lily's hand and something like recognition flickered in her face. "I'm okay," she managed, but the words were thin, as if the night had taken too much of her and returned only a draft. "I thought," Lily began, but Dr. Alvarez lifted a hand and said gently, "You did the right thing. Stay with her. We'll take her in the car. We'll be back as soon as we know more." They moved Mia carefully. Daniel helped slide her into a jacket, helped Lily into his coat when she refused to let go of her mother's hand, tucked his briefcase under his arm, and walked them down the hallway. The snow that had bitten at his ears in the morning now flurried around their shoes, muffling the city's usual argument. Before he left with them, he found a spare sweater in the hall closet, too large for Lily, but warm for the ride. Outside, the air bit with a clean hardness. Daniel wrapped the child in the oversized sweater and placed a hand at the small nape where hair gathered under the hat. "You're brave," he said, and the words felt inadequate but true.
Lily looked up at him with the kind of directness that launches small being into the future. "My mom didn't wake up," she said again, as if repeating it made it more real. He watched the car's taillights fade. He stood on the threshold of the building and felt something inside him unclench and then clench in a different shape. The shadows shifted, and a memory rose without invitation. A hospital corridor, a younger version of himself sitting beside a bed with a hand that wasn't warm enough. He swallowed the taste of that old winter and folded it away, a reflex learned in boardrooms and backrooms alike, to note, to file, to act. Inside his car, the radio tried to speak of stocks, and he turned it off. He could have driven to the clinic, but he didn't know what to offer beyond staying out of the way. Instead, he did something quietly consequential. He reached for his phone, thumbed through contacts until he found the number of his assistant and pressed call. "Elena, I need you to clear my second meeting and—" He paused. It was hard to reduce an alarm to errands. "Cancel the rest of my morning. There's an emergency. Can you find me Dr. Alvarez's number? Private. And set a time for me to visit the Market Zone Distribution Center. No press. I need to see the night crew." Elena's voice filtered through the line, efficient and used to phrase. "Yes, Mr. Ross. Shall I inform the executive team?" "Not yet," he said. "Not as a headline. Just, arrange for me to visit tonight. Make it early. And order hot meals for the night shift." He knew the words sounded small when he said them aloud, but there was something honest in smallness. Also, a rest area evaluation. Send someone from operations today. "Understood," she said. "Anything else?" "Make sure whatever we do, it reaches them without spinning into PR. No announcement." Elena hesitated for half a breath, then said, "Got it." Her competence was a kind of prayer. Daniel drove to the clinic instead of to the office. Inside the fluorescent hush of the emergency room, he listened while a nurse described dehydration, hypothermia, the ways exhaustion had stacked itself like small, unpaid bills. They would keep Mia under observation overnight, hydrate her, run a few tests. She would be discharged if she responded, with a plan: follow-up, rest, a note recommending a primary care appointment. He stayed in the waiting room the way people stay at stations, because leaving felt like a betrayal and staying felt like offering a small human ballast. Lily fell asleep in the oversized sweater, mouth parted, eyelashes long and clear in the white light. Daniel watched a child breathe and felt, under the corporate armor that usually shaped him, a less tidy tenderness. A nurse came out with a small paper cup and a slip of instructions. "She'll be fine for now," the nurse said, "but she needs time. Do you have somewhere for Lily to be if we keep her overnight?" "I can take her," Daniel said, before he realized he'd promised it aloud. It was the kind of promise that startled him by being easy to make. There should have been contingencies, names of relatives, phone numbers, a social worker, but Lily's hand twisted in the easy weight of sleep against his arm, and there was no other option that felt right in that moment. "Do you have identification with you?" the nurse asked. He dug in his wallet like someone fishing for a talisman. "Yes, and He stopped, thinking of the ways a CEO's name could complicate things. "I'm a friend." A social worker came by, asked the gentle set of questions that felt like examinations of a life, and took the rightful steps to document custody for the night. Lily murmured in her sleep and did not argue. The nurse offered him an extra blanket, which he took like a small confession. He walked with Lily back to his car, holding the child's hand. The street was quieter now. Snow lay thick, muffling the world into a gentle, wintry hush. He buckled Lily into the passenger seat and, for the first time that morning, let himself think of his own past in a way that made him feel less like a machine and more like a person who had been built, often against his will, by loss. Memory. A small hospital room, the smell of disinfectant and orange juice. The boy who would become Daniel sitting with his chin on his hands while someone else's life wound down. The next image wasn't dramatic, a plate with half-eaten toast. A lullaby hummed badly from a kitchen radio. He had been 9 or 10, or somewhere, a number like a landscape. The way grief had shaped him was not a single high mountain, but a series of ledges. He had learned to navigate them by not stopping. Today, the ledges had edges that felt like possibility. At his apartment that night, though he had every right to stay at his own house, he kept Lily in a spare room cleared for children of visiting friends, a habit he had not known he liked. He made tea again, this time with more care. It was a small kitchen. The kettle clicked and hissed, the sound filling a room that had been built for hurried dinners and brief soliloquies about quarterly results. He boiled water, warmed the oversized sweater one more time in front of the heater, and sat by Lily's bedside reading aloud because the city outside had taken a day of voice and given him small hush. Mia's texts came in later, short messages, an explanation that read like the back of a program. Night shift finished, no call back from sleep, woke too late, fainted. Daniel read them and then typed a number for the clinic and pressed send. He did not know what he was doing. He only knew he could be present, and that in the slow calculus of consequences, presence added up. The next morning, he accompanied Lily to a small clinic where Mia was conscious enough to sign paperwork and embarrassed enough to own the story herself. She spoke in clipped sentences, like someone who had spent a life forming economical truths to protect herself from pity. "I work 2 jobs," she said, not seeking sympathy. "Night stocking at Market Zone and mornings at the diner. Today I couldn't." She stopped, rearranged words. "I couldn't wake, and Lily did what she had to." Daniel listened, not because he needed details, but because stories are a form of truth-giving. She did not ask for money. She did not ask for his pity. She asked for practical help in the way people ask with their bodies. She wanted to stand on her own again and be able to go about the work she had to do without fearing that she might fall asleep and not wake. Later, at his office, Daniel sat at a window that looked out over a city that still had snow on its shoulders. He watched silhouettes of people moving beneath the gray sheen and felt the scene at the clinic like a new lens. The company he ran supplied shelves in those floors, rows and rows of packaged goods, people who worked nights hefting cases under fluorescent lights. The problem, that had been a human thing on a narrow street, now lived on a larger map. He thought of the way exhaustion stacked through a week, the way shifts blurred, the water cooler jokes that were really a coping vocabulary. He did not call a press conference. He did not send a grand memo announcing a revolution of management philosophy. Instead, he wrote 3 notes. One was an instruction to operations. Assemble a small team to conduct an overnight assessment at the Market Zone Distribution Center. Specifically, evaluate break policies, check the heating in staff areas, propose a simple hot meal program for night crews. No press, he added in a short line. We need to do this quietly and well. Another was to the head of HR.
initiate a stipend program for temporary childcare support in cases of emergency, and produce a quick list of community resources for employees who might be stretched across multiple jobs. The third note was to Elena, his assistant. Schedule a discreet meeting with the logistics manager for that evening. I want to see them, he wrote. The words on the page felt less like power and more like an obligation finally given voice. Then he closed his laptop and, in the hollow practice he had cultivated, went to check the inbox he rarely checked, the company hotline where employees sometimes reported hard things. There were messages. The language was the litany of steady lives. Someone needed time off for a parent. Someone was covering extra shifts. A note from a worker that read simply, "Please, if there's any way, even one extra break." Daniel sat back and felt a new weight settle on his shoulders, one that was not a ledger so much as a neighbor's porch light. It was practical and not particularly heroic. He poured himself a cup of coffee and thought of the smallness of gestures that, over time, might mean a person rather than a number. He returned to the clinic that evening, not as a chairman, but as a man who had been learning to do things with his hands again. Mia was sitting up, an orange juice cup sweating condensation in her hand. Lily was in the chair beside her, hair unruly, cheeks flushed with the pale heat of convalescence. They were careful with him at first, people who had met a stranger at the edge of crisis and were wary of the stranger's intentions. Mia spoke plainly. "I can pay you back," she said, in a voice that tried to make the world a transaction. "I can do extra shifts. No," Daniel interrupted gently. "I don't want repayment. I want to know how to help you keep from being in this space again." His words were not patronizing. They were offer-shaped. He was careful with his tone as if he were handling a fragile bowl. Mia's jaw tightened. She had armor for people who meant well and people who meant badly. "I don't want a handout," she said. "I don't want a parade." She looked at Lily and then back at him. "If you're offering something, make sure it's useful." "Useful," he repeated, liking the sound of it because it aligned with his work. "Okay, I'll start by ensuring the night crew at Market Zone has hot meals and a scheduled rest area. We'll pilot it quietly. We'll also make available emergency childcare options for employees who need them. No press." Mia studied him like someone reading a contract. "Will it stick?" she asked. He considered that it was a fair question. "It will if we make it easy to use," he said. "If it doesn't make their lives harder to claim it, then it will stick. If it requires forms and shame, it won't." In the edges of the clinic's fluorescent light, arrangements were made. They agreed on numbers and points of contact. Daniel gave a phone number and a name, not of a PR person, but of Elena and of the logistics manager who could assess day-to-day realities. Mia wrote them down, her handwriting steady. She asked a practical question about how to apply for the emergency childcare, and he made a note and promised to follow up. On the way out, Lily tugged on his sleeve. "Will you be back?" she asked. He glanced at Mia. There was an exchange there, something small and unspoken. Mia looked at him and then at Lily and did something that, in itself, was a decision. She nodded, barely. "If you'll be careful," she said, setting a boundary. "If you'll be consistent." "I can do that," he answered. It was not a vow he made lightly. That night, back at his apartment, Daniel laid out a spare blanket on the sofa and watched the city spill a muted neon through the windows. He wondered how much of his life could be reshaped by quiet acts and how much required policy. He felt, too, the familiar ache of a wound that never fully healed, the one left by his mother's absence. It sat in him like an unlabeled ledger item, not a deep theatrical scar, but a steady, small gravity. Memory intruded again, brief and bright and raw. A small hand in his, the smell of a hospital room, a mechanical beep. He blinked, and the image snapped away like a Polaroid fading in cold. He did not tell anyone that he had a childhood framed by waiting rooms and hurried nurses. He simply let the memory be a motive. The next morning he woke early and walked the block to the Market Zone without thinking of spreadsheets. The distribution center at dawn looked different from the glossy boardroom presentations. It was a humming, practical organism of forklifts, pallets, and people whose faces were mapped by fatigue and stubbornness in equal measure.
He kept his head down in a way that allowed him to observe without intruding. He watched a line worker take a quick cup of coffee at a makeshift table. Someone else rubbed the back of their neck between cases. He noticed the night shift had left a note in the staff break room about the heater by the loading dock being unreliable. He noticed, too, that there were always people who worked twice as hard so that someone else could keep a roof. He walked the floor, asking small questions to small people. How long are breaks? Is there a place to heat your food? Who covers for you if you're sick? And received candid answers that were either weary or pragmatic. He took notes, not the lists he used for aggressive quarterly shifts, but notes that were mute confessions, the simple mechanics of how exhaustion traveled through hours and days. That afternoon, he sent an internal message to operations. Have eager people in logistics assessment meet me tonight. He did not ask for grand estimates. He asked for the truth of people's days. He attached nothing to it but a line, no press. When he returned to Mia's building that evening, he hesitated at the door. He felt self-conscious, as if he were stepping across a threshold that should only exist between neighbors. Lily answered, hair escaping from a braid, eyes bright as if she had been lit from within. She ran to meet him and threw herself at his shins with the unexamined trust of a child. Mia watched from the doorway, coffee cup cupped in both hands like a small anchor. They sat at her kitchen table on mismatched chairs. Daniel, who was comfortable in rooms that mattered for revenue projections and logistics plans, felt awkward in the domestic geometry of a place that smelled faintly of spices and laundry. He brought nothing of formal value, no checks, no glossy brochures. Instead, he brought a bag with a homemade casserole he had failed to heat like a proper chef, but had insisted on carrying because the act of carrying felt like meaning. Mia told him, in a tone that was more factual than confessional, about the night. She had been finishing a long shift, had come home to the small apartment, had turned the heater down to save a little on the bill, and had slept the sleep of someone whose body had been pushed beyond the margin.
It was a ledger of small cuts, missed meals, skipped breaks, the algebra of survival. He listened. He remained quiet in the way people do when they want to be useful and not intrusive. He asked practical questions that were not prying. Are there neighbors who could help if you needed a hand? Do you have a primary care doctor? She had a doctor, but scheduling was hard, and the clinic's hours matched badly with her shifts. She requested, once, that there be a way for workers like her to access care that fit into a life that didn't implode when a shift overlapped with a visit. When he explained what he had in mind, hot meals, a proper rest space, a pilot program for emergency childcare, her face didn't immediately soften. Mia was cautious in the manner of someone who had been offered many kinds of help and had learned to test it. How will my coworkers know it's for them and not for the boss to look good? She asked. You tell me how to make it obvious, he said. If it's clumsy, they'll ignore it. If it's easy and it's there when they need it, they'll use it. Mia's laugh at that was dry and affectionate. Easy, huh? He rubbed his hand over the back of his neck. I'll make it as easy as I can. Conversation moved then from the clinical to the domestic. Small things like Lily's favorite cereal, the squeak in the hinge of Mia's door, the favorite mug she reserved for late shift coffee. Daniel learned the practicalities of life in the apartment. The heating turned on by a dial that was stubborn, and the stove that didn't always light on the first try. He fixed the hinge with a borrowed screwdriver, the kind of thing he had not done in years, and the sound of a door closing properly afterward carried the sort of satisfaction boardroom wins rarely gave him. He noticed how Mia moved when she laughed, guarded, a quick inhale, and how she moved when she allowed herself to set the kettle on the stove without watching it like a hawk. There were little relaxations in her posture when Livy sat at the table and told a story, when the rabbit's limp ear got a gentle tug and a whispered scolding. The room was full of small domestic beats that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with being present. At the end of the evening, when the city outside had come down to a steady whisper, Daniel stood in the doorway and looked at the two of them. Mia gathering dishes, Lily yawning, and then turning to offer a small hand to the man who had been a stranger less than a week ago. He felt a tenderness that did not demand to be dramatized. It was a quiet thing, like the warm foot of a cat at your ankle. I'll check in tomorrow, he said. Mia's eyes measured him.
We don't, she paused, searching for a word. We don't need charity. If you're here, it needs to be as a neighbor. Neighbor, he repeated, testing the label as if it were a new coat. It fit oddly, but not unpleasantly. He left with an address written on a napkin. No numbers of commitments, only a plan to return. Lily pressed her little hand into his as he went, small fingers with a surprising firmness. "Bye, Mr. Daniel," she said, because children are diplomats about names. Back at his car, he paused once more and looked up at the sky. Snow hung like confetti in slow motion, each flake settling as if taking a vote on the day's truth. He had not come to change a system when he had opened his door to a frightened child. He had come to be present. But presence rippled outward. It would need structure if it was to hold. He sent a short message to operations. Start the pilot tonight. Heat checks, rest area, hot meals, not PR. Keep it low profile. Report back in 48 hours. He typed it, paused, and then added one sentence he meant for himself as much as for anyone else. This is about keeping people safe. Think about Lily when you make decisions. The message went into the string of daily directives that blurred into corporate life. He knew how easily things could be filed under compassion gestures and then shelved. He also knew how a small, quiet change could, if tended, refuse to be shelved. That night, sleep came to him differently. It arrived not as relief but as a thing earned, to keep showing up. He dreamt of a child knocking on his door, of warm blankets, of hands holding on when the world wanted to let go. He awoke with the tenderness still at his ribs, a small insistence that life had just handed him a responsibility wrapped in a child's voice. In the days that followed, Daniel moved through familiar precincts of influence with unusual slowness. He visited the distribution center and saw the first tentative signs of action. Someone had fixed 2 space heaters by the loading dock. Anonymous packages of hot soup had been put into a staff fridge with a note that read, "For night crew." Small logistics teams inspected the restrooms and scribbled on clipboards. Elena reported back that the stipend program paperwork was being drafted quietly, and the HR director had identified 3 community childcare resources to partner with. It was not a revolution. It was a series of low, honest interventions. He watched, in the span of a week, a tired worker accept a bowl of soup without looking up, for fear of being observed, and then, minutes later, offer a faint smile when a colleague sat down beside them. A clerk sent an email to HR that read, simply, "Thanks." None of it flashed on the screens of social feeds. No headlines declared heroism. It felt, to Daniel, like the right shape for something meant to last. Meanwhile, at Mia's apartment, small domestic rhythms reassembled themselves. Meals were thicker, the heater seemed less aggressive in its mood swings, and Lily played with her rabbit in the sun patch on the floor, a patch that had been cleared with deliberate care. Mia went to the clinic for a follow-up, and the doctor recommended slower schedules and prioritized care. She did not become a different person overnight. She became slightly less precarious. Daniel found himself showing up in other small ways, dropping off a soup when he knew she had a long shift, returning a borrowed screwdriver, bringing a pair of gloves he had forgotten he owned. He never offered a check. He never suggested that he could fix everything. He simply offered what he could do. Mia treated him like a neighbor with an unusual job title. She accepted gifts when they were useful, deflected them when they smacked of pity, and set boundaries like clean lines. There were quiet questions he carried with him, not least one that rose up in the solitude of nights. Why did a child's voice unmake him more effectively than 1,000 boardroom arguments? He did not search out an answer in speeches. He learned its contours in small ways. Here, a night of extra meals. There, a shift policy that allowed for a short, guaranteed rest. He discovered the surprising arithmetic of constancy, that one steady presence, repeated over time, could scaffold recovery in ways dramatic gestures could not. In the pause between action and consequence, a memory caught him again, sudden and precise. A woman humming while she folded laundry, a hand squeezing his shoulder, and then absence. He felt the old grief rise, raw and patient, but this time it sat beside his other feelings rather than obliterating them. He moved through his days with a new kind of purpose that felt neither wholly personal nor entirely practical. It was a hybrid, the result of a child at a doorstep and a lifetime of instruction about how to move things at scale. One evening, as the weeks turned like someone flipping a calendar, he sat on a park bench with Lily and watched Mia push her stroller with a friend from the distribution center who had come by to bring a slice of pastry. Lily climbed onto his lap and pointed at the sky. "Snow," she said, delighted as if it had been invented for her. Daniel found that he could enjoy small things without measuring them for outcome. He had begun, privately, to imagine the small future that might grow if he tended to it. Not a fairy tale, not a rescue story that erased anyone's agency, but a life where exhaustion was less likely to be catastrophic, and where a child could knock on a door and be met by neighbors instead of emergencies alone. He did not tell Mia these imaginings. He carried them like a whispered plan, tentative and respectful. Back at the office, the operations team sanded down the rough edges of the pilot plan. Hot meals were being rolled out to a few sites at first. Rest areas were cataloged and made accessible. The HR stipend paperwork was brief and anonymous so that no one would feel the shame of applying.
The moment was ordinary in its perfection, the kind of scene that, if you resembled it precisely enough, could almost be mistaken for happiness itself. Daniel realized then that the largest thing he could offer was not dramatic or media-friendly. It was simple presence paired with concrete action, repeated over and over until it became habit. He folded his hands against his coat and watched the child with a clarity that surprised him. There were things to do. There were meetings to schedule, people to convince, capped with the small domestic rituals that made life livable. Soup on a stubbornly cold night, a screwdriver used to fix a hinge, a call that made a clinic appointment possible without 2 missed shifts. He stood up to leave, and Lily ran to the bench to throw her arms around him. Brief, certain, no need to measure meaning. Mia did not retreat. She watched them and then met his eyes. No words were necessary for the exchange that passed between them. Gratitude, reservation, a willingness to consider new arrangements. Daniel left the park knowing the story was only beginning. The immediate crisis had been met. The follow-through was in motion. There remained the question of how a corporation could be transformed not through headline gestures, but through the stubborn repetition of small, worker-centered choices. There remained the human work of becoming a neighbor without making anyone into a project. He walked away with the snow in his shoes and the firm sense that he would return. He also carried, like a fragile lantern, the memory of Lily's voice, the small sentence that had rerouted a morning, and perhaps, quietly, the rest of his days. If this moved you, consider tapping like. It's a small way to keep stories like this in view. He did not know, as the city lights blurred into a wash, what he would say next time he stood on that porch. He only knew that he would stand there again, not because he had to, but because he had chosen to. He left the bench before the sky had gone completely dark, the snow turning the city into a softer outline. The feeling that had nested at his ribs, an insistence disguised as tenderness, didn't resolve overnight. It stretched into days that required follow-through, patience, and the kind of stubborn repetition that bureaucracy hates. At the office, he spent mornings in meetings and evenings in small practicalities. The pilot rolled out slowly, as he had intended. A few sites first, then more. The rest areas were modest. An insulated room with cots and blackout curtains, a kettle, a small microwave. Operations installed a simple card system so workers could heat a meal without asking a manager. HR pushed the childcare stipend through with a 1-page application and anonymous enrollment. Elena kept him updated in terse bullet points, metrics, uptake rates, a few wrinkles to smooth.
No banner headlines, no glossy photo ops.
It felt, to both him and to the workers who used the services, like medicine applied in quiet doses. There were hiccups. One pilot site ran out of soup on a Friday night because demand had been underestimated, leaving a line of tired faces at the staff fridge. An operations manager accidentally leaked the program in a casual staff memo that reached a local blog. Daniel handled both the same way he had handled the first morning, hands-on and small. He ordered immediate restocking and had the manager go in person the next night with an extra thermos. He asked Elena to remind the communications team to keep internal explanations simple and direct so workers wouldn't feel observed. He walked the floors himself more often than his schedule required, not to be seen, but to be sure the parts actually worked. On the ground, changes began to show in subtle ways. A night crew forewoman who had been perpetually pushing at 3 jobs took a break in the new rest area and came back with a steadier gait and fewer headaches. A young loader, who had been juggling school and 2 shifts, used the stipend once to cover a last-minute babysitter and later sent a short message to HR. "Helped me out, thank you." Those notes, small, unsigned thanks, arrived in the inboxes and were read aloud at a meeting once, not for applause but as reminder. This is what the work was for. Meanwhile, the 3 of them, Mia, Lily, and Daniel, settled into a rhythm that felt careful and improvised in equal measure. They were not a manufactured family. They were a cluster of people who liked showing up for one another. The apartment remained the humble center of their small universe. Chipped mugs, a stubborn heater dial, the beloved rabbit with missing seams. Daniel's presence was the kind that arrived in practical increments. Dropped-off soup, a screwdriver left on the kitchen table, a medical appointment scheduled with a clinic that kept evening hours. One afternoon, a week or 2 after that park bench, Lily fell from the playground ladder and came down with a gash on her knee. The sound, sharp and childlike, had the immediate, ruinous quality that makes adults move without thinking. Daniel was at the sandbox before he knew it, palms raw from unbuttoning his cuff. He knelt, inspecting the scrape, feeling the grit on a child's skin and the sting on the edge of his own memory. There are little wounds that never leave you, and little ones that you learn to tend. "Does it hurt?" he asked softly. Lily nodded, the lower lip pushed out a little. Mia, who had been on the bench watching, rose with the efficient calm of someone who had learned to measure danger and choose the right response. Daniel rinsed the wound with bottled water, pressed a clean gauze pad, and talked low to keep the child's breathing steady. He had taken the first aid class Dr. Alvarez suggested. Nothing heroic, only careful, exact actions. Pressure, cleanliness, a kiss that Mia made him give because that was their arrangement. "You're okay," he told Lily when the bandage was secure. Lily considered this, then announced, bright and solemn, "You're my pal, Dan." Daniel's chest folded in a new way at the nickname. It carried no entitlement. It carried trust in a language a child invents when someone is reliably there. Weeks slipped into months with small rituals marking the passage. Saturday mornings were Mia baked an apology cake for things that didn't require apology, the recipe messy on the counter. Daniel teaching Lily how to tie the bow on a shoelace, his fingers patient and clumsy. Dinners shared on mismatched plates, the conversation orbiting around homework and whether the rabbit needed a new button eye. The more ordinary the days became, the more the question that lived in Daniel's quieter hours pressed on him. What kind of presence did he want to be? He had come to the porch that first morning because a child's voice unmade certainties. He had stayed because the work required sustained attention. But words needed to follow the pattern of his actions, and there was a moment where speech seemed necessary, not to rewrite the shape of anyone's life, but to make an intention plain. It happened on a late afternoon, the sky a thin wheat color. The 3 of them sat at a small outdoor table at a cafe near the park after Lily's violin class. Lily gnawed at a muffin, all knees and concentration. Mia had loosened the knot of her scarf and looked less guarded than she had months ago, the tired lines around her mouth softened by small rests. Daniel had his hands wrapped around a paper cup, feeling the heat through the cardboard like a tether.
They traded stories, the banal currency of a life. And at a small moment, when Lily had spun a tale about a classmate, and Mia had laughed in a way he had grown used to, Daniel said, "There's something I want to tell you." Mia's hands stilled. The air tightened by a fraction as her face took on that look of pragmatic attention. Saying something like this required courage no less than fixing a rest area. He leaned forward, kept his voice level. He started, the words finding a path through a memory that flared and then calmed. Images of hospital waiting rooms rose for a second. A child who had learned to measure loss. He swallowed and then said with a simple steadiness, "I want to be the one she calls Dad." It was not a grand proclamation. It was a quiet proposal, an offering shaped by the everyday. He watched Mia as the words landed. She did not soften at once. She considered the edges, measured the practicalities. That was how she had always handled decisions, by checking the hinge, testing the lock, seeing whether elbow grease made the action reliable. Mia took a moment that stretched and then closed. Her jaw worked, not out of confusion, but to keep the sentence neat and free of damage. "That's a big thing to say," she replied, "and it's an easy word to use. It's heavier to be with." "I know," he said. "I don't mean to rush anything. I want to show up. I want to be steady, if you'll let me. Not to replace who you are or what you do, but to be another person who cares for Lily and for you, if that's something you want." Mia looked at Lily, who had angled her head like a small judge in training, then back at Daniel. There was a moment that felt as if the world had pared itself down to 3 breaths. Mia's answer came purely, without spectacle. "If it's steady, not performative, if you don't try to fix us like we're broken, if you respect that this is my life and I decide the pace, then yes." He felt a relief that was practical rather than theatrical. He reached for Mia's hand on the table, not to claim, but to confirm, and she did not pull away. Lily beamed with the clear, uncomplicated joy children have when grown-ups make arrangements that expand safety. Their acceptance was not a marriage vow. It was a set of small, enforceable promises. To be punctual when they said they'd be present, to respect privacy, to contribute in ways that preserved Mia's agency. It was as much a contract of habit as of heart. From that moment, the gestures multiplied in ordinary ways. Daniel found himself attending school recitals and bringing a thermos of cocoa to the couch when exams were done. He asked Mia once if she wanted the help of a professional for taxes or paperwork, practical things that never made the news but eased the scaffolding of life. Mia declined some offers and accepted others. She chose the boundaries and taught him how to respect them. At work, the reforms were no longer pilot notes, but routines gaining muscle. The anonymous card for meals became a quiet ritual at distribution centers. A few managers were skeptical at first, wary of anything that didn't fit the old ledger, but the evidence was unambiguous. Fewer near misses on the floor, more employees clearing doctor's appointments without fear of losing a shift, a decline in last-minute call-outs when rest times were honored. Workers began to speak about the changes without hyperbole. They mentioned them as things that made the day less precarious. One evening, after a long week, Mia knocked on Daniel's door. She came not for a rescue, but for a favor. The boiler in her building had conked out, and she needed a temporary heater for the night. Daniel fetched one from his building supplies and carried it up 2 flights with the kind of easy competence he had developed hauling cases at the distribution centers he now visited sometimes. "You've become good with tools," she observed, breathing a little from the climb. "I learned a few things when a hinge needed fixing," he said, and they both smiled, the sort of smile that held a history in miniature. They shared dinner at her table that night, a simple stew Mia had pulled together with groceries that had been easier to manage thematically thanks to slightly steadier schedules. Lily talked about drawing a picture for Dad, the word used with a new, growing intimacy. In the corner of the room, the rabbit's stitched ear shuddered when Lily laughed. The seasons turned.
A photo, once taken as an afterthought on a phone, came to signify their small family. A candid shot of them on the couch, Mia leaning her head on Daniel's shoulder, Lily with her head tucked against Mia, the rabbit propped on the armrest. It wasn't posted anywhere. It was printed and framed by a neighbor who did small kindnesses. It found a place on Mia's thin bookshelf, where the pages of old textbooks and a stack of unpaid bills shared space with something more durable. There were days when progress felt thorny. An operations restructure threatened to reprioritize the pilots. A logistics manager who had been supportive took a promotion and left. In those instances, Daniel did the less glamorous work, the kind that doesn't make speeches. He sat in meetings and pushed for small budget lines, defended the rest areas during resource allocation, and checked the anonymous application flow with HR to make sure the process still moved without friction. Sometimes his interventions were met with bureaucratic resistance. Sometimes they were taken as reasonable. The point was not victory, but persistence. Mia's independence remained intact. She worked shifts, she refused offers that felt like pity, and she kept a tight accounting of what she could and could not accept. Daniel learned to gauge when to step in and when to step back. When legal red tape threatened to slow an emergency childcare grant, he handled it through his channels quietly, never making a spectacle. When Mia refused a dinner because she needed to sleep before a long night, he respected that as part of the agreement they'd made, presence shaped by consent. Their love, if love is the neat word, grew as choices do, incrementally, through care, through showing up. It wasn't fireworks. It was a series of small repairs, a willingness to be inconvenienced, a consistency that became obvious with time. When Lily woke with nightmares, there were more than one lap to choose from. When Mia had a bad day at work, there was a warm meal waiting and a logistics manager who had started covering shifts without being asked. The neighborhood took notice in the way neighborhoods do, with casual human observation. A neighbor commented one morning as they passed with the stroller, "You folks look settled." It was not flattery, but the accurate notice of people who had watched a life rearrange itself and recognized the labor in it. One evening toward winter, when the air was crystalline and the porch light cast a soft glow on the steps, Daniel found himself stirring a pot of soup on Mia's stove. Later, they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, the rabbit between them and Lily asleep inside with a fever that had broken. The neighborhood took notice in the way neighborhoods do, with casual human observation. A neighbor commented one morning as they passed with the stroller, "You folks look settled." It was not flattery, but the accurate notice of people who had watched a life rearrange itself and recognized the labor in it. One evening toward winter, when the air was crystalline and the porch light cast a soft glow on the steps, Daniel found himself stirring a pot of soup on Mia's stove. Later, they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, the rabbit between them and Lily asleep inside with a fever that had broken. Daniel held Mia's hand without announcing anything. The simple intimacy of mutual warmth said more than any speech could. Mia leaned her head on his shoulder for a small span of time he counted as a gift. "You wanted something honest," she said at last. "I did," he answered. "I wanted to say I'm here." "You have been," she said, "in ways I didn't always expect. You've been practical, annoying sometimes, and steady. Those are good things." They didn't promise forever, nor did they need to script the future. They simply agreed, by the quiet business of living together, to continue the work they'd begun, to protect a child's safety, to respect one another's autonomy, to keep asking whether what they did helped or harmed. The company's changes kept unfolding without headlines. After months of quiet implementation and iteration, there was measurable impact at the center level. A reduction in night shift fatigue reports, fewer missed appointments, a small but meaningful decrease in the number of emergency incidents that left families scrambling. A worker who once covered shifts for 2 friends told a supervisor that she could now take 1 shift off to attend a parent-teacher meeting. The HR team quietly tracked utilization of the stipend and rest areas and began sharing best practices across facilities. It was not a revolution, it was a creeping reformation of the everyday. One afternoon, a courier from the distribution center slipped a folded note into Mia's mailbox. It read, simply, "Thanks, we notice." It was unsigned and earnest, and probably written by someone who hadn't learned how to say gratitude directly. Mia tucked it into the bread box and smiled at the small thing. At home, they kept adding ordinary artifacts to their life. A second mug stamped with a chipped star, a shelf repaired to hold cookbooks, a frame with that candid photo that had taken on an odd sacredness. They celebrated Lily's small victories. The first time she rode her bike without training wheels, the day she brought home a gold star for doing extra reading. Daniel learned how to braid hair, poorly but enthusiastically. Mia taught him to make coffee in a way that didn't taste like burnt metal. The final thread of change was not a single speech or a press release, but this accumulation of choices. The distribution center's overnight workers started to show up less wound tight. Their faces loosened in the margins, people began to take turns covering last-minute calls without stress, and a tiny culture of mutual care took root. Daniel observed it and felt the unusual satisfaction of an executive's task fulfilled quietly, the sort of fulfillment that doesn't need an award. Months after the first knock on his door, the three of them stood together on Mia's porch as snow began to fall. Lily, taller now by the almost imperceptible measure of a child in growth, clutched the rabbit and peered at the sky. The flakes settled on her hat and melted into her hair. Mia stood close, their hips touching by habit, a small domestic gravity. Daniel felt the honest contentment of someone who had chosen to create a particular kind of life and then had the humility to let that life define itself, not to stage it. He thought of the morning when he had first opened the door to a child's plea and how that small sentence had rerouted him. He didn't use the moment to declare victory. There were still nights when budgets tightened and schedules compressed. There were still days he had to ensure the pilots didn't peter out. But the pattern of their days had shifted in a way that made tragedies less likely and helped dignity show up even in small pockets of the world. Lily hopped down the steps and, on impulse, turned to them. "Say cheese," she said, pulling a phone from her pocket like a magician, though she'd barely learned to use the camera. She positioned them, squinting into the porch light, and grinned. Mia put an arm around Daniel, and he curved his shoulder in the space, an unassuming anchor. The camera clicked. A real, ordinary picture was captured. No filters, no audience, simply a record of a moment. Daniel took the small print after it was developed and placed it on Mia's bookshelf, between the cookbooks and a stack of carefully folded paperwork. Underneath, he slipped a note he'd written earlier one evening when sleepless thoughts ran long. Not a rescue, a choice, always steady. He left it there like a talisman that reminded them of the terms they'd all accepted. They stayed on the porch as the snow thickened into a hush. Lily began to hum a tune, one she had learned at school, and her voice, small and hopeful, stitched itself into the cold. Mia leaned into him, warm and ordinary, and the rabbit sat on her lap like the squire of their small domain. Daniel did not imagine he had solved everything. He had learned that presence could be a discipline as much as a feeling, that policy without follow-through was brittle, and that the kind of help people want is the kind that preserves their dignity. He also knew, in a way he had not before, that some losses bend a person in a direction that can be used to tend other people's lives. That realization did not make him a hero. It made him a neighbor, a man who had made his life intentionally less solitary. When the wind picked up, Lily reached for Mia's hand, and then, on her own, slipped her small fingers into Daniel's. It was an act of the easiest kind of trust, unasked for and freely given. Mia watched them with the expression of someone who had rebuilt a wall and found, to her surprise, that the doorway held. They stayed that way until the snow had settled into a white blanket and the porch light bloomed around them. The night felt like a quiet promise, less about flashy endings and more about the slow work of keeping warm and making sure someone else could do the same. If you loved witnessing their small courage, consider subscribing for more stories that remind us presence matters.